Hello there, and welcome back to Parley. Vampbug has paid me $9 this month to talk about a January parlay from their boyfriend. You said, how to mechanics brained person communicate with vibes brained person, also the other way around. That's the request. Vampbug says I tried asking him to elaborate on wording a little further, but your guess is as good as mine. Good luck, have fun. Good luck, have fun, we shall. Actually, let's read it again, shall we? So Vampug's boyfriend asked, quote, how to mechanics brained person communicate with vibes brained person, also the other way around. Cool. I think that's manageable. Mechanics brain person, vibes brain person. Well, I think that when people have trouble communicating with each other, it's almost always the same root cause. And that root cause is very simply that they have, for one reason or another, and the reason will depend on whether they're the mechanics brain person, the vibes brain person, or some other thing, other brain. For one reason or another, they've decided that their understanding is the correct one, or has primacy, or is the obvious one. Maybe I think those are the common things. Either it's literally just correct, not that there's any such thing most of the time, or it's unusual that someone is interpreting something differently than they are. Their understanding is not necessarily correct as much as just obvious. It's only really obvious to them, but they view it as being sort of universally obvious. Or in some other way, philosophically, that their method has primacy, using some thinking that they have done off camera. The partner in the conversation doesn't know what that thinking is, but they have done some thinking in their life that establishes that this understanding is sort of like the only viable one. The problem is that the other person in the conversation doesn't know that, like, why they think that, basically. Or there could be other reasons. I kind of added a third type of person in there, maybe a philosophizer or a overthinker. I don't know. But the key is that I don't think that they're misunderstanding each other because they have incompatible ways of thinking about something. It would be easy, and I will go on to talk about this more later in the parlay. It would be easy to think of the mechanics brain person as just reaching a different conclusion because they used a different process. And that might be why the nominal conclusion they've reached is different. In other words, if you're arguing about a definition of something or whether a friend really was interested in you or whatever, I don't know, a social understanding or a literary understanding or whatever, and you're arguing about what understanding of that situation or term or whatever makes sense. It is probably true that mechanics brain person arrived at a different conclusion than vibes brained person, and we'll talk about those later more, because they have different methodologies for reaching the answer. In other words, mechanics brained person might say something like, well, I looked up the definition of this word and it's literally this. Like, that is the definition that is here. Therefore, that is just the correct understanding of that word. And your understanding, if it is not that one, is wrong. That's just wrong. It is. I checked. Vibes brain person might say, yeah, but like everybody knows that this word is understood to mean this. People read between the lines and say this thing. Now, mechanics brain person is probably going to say something like, yeah, but I'm not talking about that. You know, the definition of the word is this. Vibes brain person will shoot back, yeah, but who cares? Because everybody knows that it's actually this, etc., etc. Back and forth they'll go. Now, this might seem like a very childish argument, but at the core of it, you understand that mechanics brained and vibes brained person seem to have had a disagreement because they use different methodologies, but my opinion is that's actually not why that disagreement is happening. It's actually happening because they've both decided that being right, or their understanding being comfortable, I guess, is more important than understanding. It's not as important to them, evidently, to understand each other. It's more important to them that their way of figuring out the answer is proven to be effective or like acceptable or correct. And why is that? Well, basically, I guess because they're somewhat insecure. We're all somewhat insecure. They have a feeling like it would be very frustrating if somebody argued that their way of understanding the world, which seems to have worked up until now, and which helps them like not have an existential breakdown right now, was wrong. It's almost like you're saying that their way of understanding the world is incorrect, which suggests that almost everything they've done up until this point in their life is somehow suspect. I know that might seem dramatic, but I really do think that there's an underlying anxiety like that there. And a lot of people have, they don't think that exact thing to that exact magnitude, but they have kind of a little grain of that that sort of wears away like a little sandpaper when there's a disagreement with someone. Like, how can that not be? I have so much, to them it will seem like evidence that this way of understanding things is good or does work. And I would like to briefly break down how that happens, because it's not very complicated, very briefly. One, a lot of the time that people have a misunderstanding in casual conversation, they pretend they didn't. I've met many people who will insist that their own meaninglessly small experience somehow constitute like everybody thinking a thing, right? Which, of course, that doesn't make any sense. And I'll often not bother saying, but I have sometimes made the mistake of saying, been misguided, and tried to convince them, which doesn't work as I'm describing, but I've tried to do this sometimes. I'll say something like, well, not only did you not have, it's not like you've had all experiences, you had a very limited experience. Of course, you adapted to whatever your experience was. So you're going to produce the answer that appears to be right given your experience. You would give any answer that appeared to be right given any random experience that I, as a manipulative God, gave you. And it would seem like that was right, but that's a meaninglessly small amount of data. Not only is that true, there also may have been many people in your experience who actually didn't agree with that thing, but they just said they did, or they didn't really understand, but they said they did. That's incredibly common. And we all know this is common if we think about it, right? People don't want to seem stupid or like they don't understand in a conversation full of what to them they kind of weirdly flatteringly assume to be other intelligent people who are also probably confused themselves. They'll say, yeah, I know what you mean, or yeah, I've seen that, or whatever. I completely happily admit, because I don't want to be like that I sometimes almost accidentally do that, and then later say, wait, no, 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 I totally haven't seen that. Sorry. What is that thing you're talking about? Which, by the way, like, I don't think most people will get upset if you do that. You should be willing to just admit if you do this by mistake. You don't have to say, hey, I'm super insecure and got nervous in a social situation because I'm in touch with my emotions, so I noticed that I lied and said I'd seen that when I hadn't, but I'm actually interested in what you have to say, so please tell me about it. You don't have to literally say that, but if you just backtrack on the thing and say, wait, no, I was thinking about something else or whatever, tell me about your thing, most people will respond positively in my experience. Anyway, just as an aside. My point is that a lot of the time, I think, people both sides are going to have a different thing they're thinking that appears to have come from a different place, but the logical fallacy underlying it is actually the same or very similar. It's basically that they've put a little bit too much faith or stock in their subjective, probably not as it seemed, and very limited experience. When really, if you want understanding, you need to drop those things and be willing to see how the other person understood it, to gain an understanding that is better than both of your understandings alone. Again, I want to insist, especially for the mechanics brained people, that you're gonna hear people argue something like, but this is literally correct. This is the correct definition. I have some way of demonstrating that it is more correct, or the scientific community agrees that it's correct. That's a really common one. But in this conversation, that doesn't matter, does it? Because the point of a definition is so it will be understood, and it's not being understood. So if you either do not want communication, in which case there is no reason for you to be participating in this conversation, or you do want communication, in which case no matter what your reasoning is for an understanding being better, it just isn't in the context of this conversation, because its only purpose would be understanding, and it isn't creating understanding. Very few people that get to the point of having an argument like this will accept that. So I'm not suggesting that you use that as an argument, by the way. If people are at the point where they've abandoned the utility of a way of communicating in favor of just insisting that their understanding is correct, like you're kind of screwed. And so I did want to talk about it a little bit, but I think it's more productive to spend some of the parlay now talking about how to improve understanding between people that have different. I feel like learning styles is something that you're evoking here. So let's try to do that. What do I mean, I guess? While mechanics brain person and vibes brain person, in my opinion, when they're having a disagreement, actually made the same, fallacy, it appears like they arrived at different conclusions because they have different methods, but the reason for the conflict at all is actually just because they both insist on something that is not in the spirit of communication. That's what I said in the first part. But the fact that they have different methodologies also matters, especially mostly if they're not disagreeing, if they're just trying to learn from each other. In a positive sense, I think it matters a lot more what their approach or methodology for thinking is. And I also want to insist, whether you accept it or not, you'll have to decide. But I would insist that there really aren't, as much as people treat it like there are, completely different uh, ways of understanding things. It's not like some people, you'll meet people who act like they never have reasoning for anything, but they do, though. They really do. The reasoning is just something they won't put to words, or they think they shouldn't put it to words, or it doesn't need to be put to words, or they can't yet put it to words. But it's not like they just magically don't have reasoning for the things they think. My evidence for this is that you'll notice that these vibes brained people are pretty consistent. Surely there's reasoning. There's some system helping them decide what they think, helping them confirm the right answer or whatever. Because otherwise, wouldn't their views be all over the place? But they're not, generally. Usually they have relatively cohesive views. In fact, you might find more rogue opinions in the mechanics brained person who's locked onto reasoning so much that some weird reasoning given at some point kind of got stuck with them, and they think something that is kind of out of place with the rest of their ideas. Anyway, so let's say, for example, you're me and you're trying to explain build systems to people. Let me give you an example of something that I've been trying to get better at explaining recently. I feel like I need to do a video about this, and I'm having trouble figuring out how to explain it so a lot of people will find it useful. And so I'm trying to think about that. So there's a lot of stuff to break down, but hopefully this will help you at least begin to think about how you could improve comprehension when you're trying to communicate an idea to somebody else who probably doesn't think in the exact same process you do. I don't claim to be great at this, by the way, so just like buckle up or get some popcorn or something. Here we go. The thing is, it's hard to even name it because I feel like that's going to confuse people. But we need a topic name. So the way I'm going to refer to it is sort of separate multipliers in builds. And here's what I mean. Let's say that I give you stat A and stat B, and you have 200 points to allocate to stat A and stat B. These are what are going to calculate your damage when you attack. Stat A is your attack damage. So if you hit and you do 100 base damage, you can invest points into stat A, and then that will multiply your base 100 damage by that number. So maybe you invest 100 points into stat A, now your damage is 100 times 100, we're at 10,000. Pretty good, 10,000 damage, nice. Stat B does the same thing, but it multiplies stat A as well. Stat A and B multiply each other. So if you put your 200 points I gave you evenly into stat A and stat B, you multiply your damage of 100 by 100 and then 100, and you get a million, I guess. 10,000. People are going to laugh at me if I do the math wrong, which is fine. Anyway, you get the point. They multiply. You can see how if you were to choose to instead put your 100 stat points in A and then not put your second 100 points in stat B, but put them in stat A again, you would then multiply your 100 base damage hit by 200 instead of just by 100 and then 100 again, and that would give you much less damage. You would only do 20,000 damage instead of a million damage, right? Or 100,000 damage. Again, I we're going to get into why this is a problem already. But you see, it does a lot less damage. That principle allows you to very easily guesstimate, ballpark estimate about how much stat distribution is effective in basically all games with all build options. If you have a game that has a variety of different stats, you can use this method without doing any direct math to ballpark estimate what gives you basically the most damage. It won't give you necessarily the exact most damage, but you'll get, 95%, and it often will be literally the most damage. And you don't need to know exact math to do it. In fact, it's irrelevant to do exact math most of the time. How can that be? Now, there's so many problems with explaining this. First of all, I'm aware that that example was confusing for a lot of people. It's too abstract. It's too in the air. A lot of people have trouble holding those numbers in their head. So even though the numbers are very simple, just holding that equation on your mental blackboard is hard. For example, there's a common test people will do where they say, okay, look at the table. I'll do it with you. Look at the table and imagine an apple. Imagine an apple on the table, whatever apple you like. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being you cannot see the apple, and 10 being your eyes projected a hologram of a real apple onto the table, how much can you see the apple, basically? So you're looking at the table, you're trying to picture an apple on the table. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much can you see the apple? Again, you might say something like, I can see it really clearly, but only in my head or whatever, and that's all fine. Let's just say wherever you see the apple when you attempt to do that, how clearly do you see the apple? Let's say it that way. I would say for me, it's maybe a 7. I definitely have trouble holding all the details in mind at once. The shadow is hard. I can kind of see an apple there, I guess. I don't know. And one of the reasons that I'm hesitating so much is because what this experiment usually demonstrates to people is that before this, unbeknownst to them, people have massively varied ability to do this thing. A lot of people would think, like what you hear people say when they do it is 10, of course, like I can see the apple there. And then someone says 1 and they go, what? Like, not everyone can do that? Not everyone can picture a thing in their head? Like, that's still kind of mind blowing to me, to be honest with you. But it's real. Like, that is a real thing. This is a real skill that some people have more than others. It's probably partially genetic and learned, and I don't know, everything is like that. Let's not get into that now. But the reason I bring that up is that there's a lot of difficulties involved if I'm to explain this multipliers thing to you. Now, the premise I can state to you, I can say there is a method without really doing math that allows you to kind of guesstimate what is basically the most damage in any arbitrary, reasonable game with build options, like different stats you could pick. And the method is basically to evenly distribute them. Now, there could be many, many problems already. One of them is that my example was probably too abstract for a lot of people. You could then get people to do out the math, but a lot of people might have a hang up about feeling like they're bad at math, even though it's practically not even math, etc., right? Another problem people might have is they would say, that just isn't true, though. Like, that's not true. They're not saying, how can that be true? They're saying, I already know that's not true. And what's happening there, you would be wise to notice, is that they must have assumed something you said means something you didn't mean, and they already know that that's not possible or something. For example, when I explained it that way to one person, they said to me, yeah, that's not true. And I said, okay, why? And they said, well, some developers just aren't good at developing games. Like, I can make a game right now that doesn't work for. And I said, oh, right, yeah, that's what I meant by games with meaningful build options or reasonably designed games. I would then need to include a part where I would say either the game isn't worth playing for its build decisions, or you can figure them out without doing math, basically. And why. A lot of people will also continue to bounce off of the explanation until you've explained why that is, or like what the mechanic behind the mechanic is. In other words, my experience has been that people often want different steps of the explanation first. Not everybody wants the same step at the same time. So let's, as an exercise, we've got a third of the parlay left. Let me just brainstorm for a minute how I would make a video to explain this with my understanding right now, which is kind of limited. I don't plan to do this, next month. It's going to be maybe this year. I don't know. To me, it seems like you kind of need to let the audience pick what order they consume the explanation in. So I guess that means I need to make timestamps and explain each part, each part as if they haven't read the other parts, listened to the other parts. So I might do something like, I'll start the video by saying, when you make builds, there's a lot of fun options in a lot of build games, but you usually need to do enough damage. That's the kind of restrictions that breed creativity. Most games, that's what the restriction is. You might view games as being games where you need to figure out how to do the most damage. And that's fine if you prefer to think of it that way. But some of you may think of games that way simply because you often don't do enough damage, when it is actually very possible to do more than enough damage and just pick whatever you want for the rest of the stuff. So that might be useful for those people. And you also might be a player who isn't really that concerned with doing enough damage. You just want to focus on putting weird stuff in your build, but you do want to like clear the missions in the game or whatever. So you may, want to know an easy way to do enough damage. Probably some of those people actually copy other people's builds regularly so as to just save time. And I'm here to tell you that there is another method you might prefer. You might not, but you might prefer it. You can get basically the most damage, or it will always be enough damage in these games, in any game that is reasonably well designed, if you can assume that the game is made by competent developers and that the game is trying to have there be meaningful options, which, that's hard to define. But what are you going to do? Without doing any math, pretty quickly, actually. And all you really have to do is figure out how to spread out all the different ways you get damage evenly, based on how much the game gives you when the game gives you a certain amount of damage, and based on how many places you have to get more damage. As long as you understand those opportunity costs, if you evenly spread out your resources as much as you can or within reason, you will do a good amount of damage. You will generally be able to actually drop some of that damage because the benefits of doing this are so large mathematically that you will no longer need exactly the right things to do enough damage. If you're a player who doesn't normally do enough damage, you promptly will with this method. And if you're a player that doesn't really care about that, you will promptly no longer need to care about that using this method. Following are 3 sections, I would then say. Section 1 will be mathematically, why is that? Section 2 will be an example. Section 3 will be the implications or games that buck the trend or whatever. Now, what I've done is try to explain it in a way that the order of the video, if people don't use the timestamps, is hopefully sensible. I'm trying to guess what is the easiest overall way to understand it. But I'm also understanding that there's enough people that for whom that won't be a good way to understand it, that this video will miss many people if I don't make there be some different route. I probably don't need to explain the implications and exceptions in a way that assumes that you skipped to that part, right? But the first and the second section, the thing where I talk about why mathematically and then an example of how to use it, I probably will need to do those in a way where you don't need to watch the one to view the other. Maybe that won't be that bad. It is about not doing math after all. The why section will have a little bit of math. Maybe that should be second so it doesn't turn people off. That's another element. Attention. This doesn't just matter to a creator. You might be a person who knows that your conversation partner doesn't have infinite attention. You'd be wise to do so because people don't have infinite attention. So you're trying to explain in a way that not only will address their concerns and help them understand, but also will hold their attention relatively easily. People are much more willing to understand when they think something's going to be fun. My dad, for example, doesn't really play video games. Everybody could enjoy video games, of course. There's so many different kinds of video games, every possible kind of video game under the sun. So, of course, everybody can enjoy video games, no matter what your uh, physical difficulties with video games. My dad has big hands and often complains about controllers, or your mental unfamiliarity with video games, or whatever. The video game industry has gotten a lot better at accessibility, and really the reason I insist on this isn't because it's so good at that, it's because there's just so many video games that have so many different media. And I truly believe that people who say video games are not for them just don't know that they indeed would enjoy them. But of course, that doesn't really matter. Their understanding of video games, like in the beginning of the parlay, isn't the same as my understanding. And my understanding is wrong because they're the one I want to understand. So it doesn't matter that they are, like, technically the thing they think is impossible about video games isn't. That doesn't matter for right now. Unless I have a way to convince them that that's the case to their satisfaction, not to mine, then it doesn't matter. So can I do that? And for a lot of people, the answer is no, because the other person would be willing to learn, but they're not because they don't see why. What's going to be fun about this? I fear in this multiplier video I'm going to write that a lot of people are going to view it as, yeah, like this could be helpful, but I just don't care enough because I'm interested in making interesting builds, not getting the damage part out of the way. When in fact, I'm certain, personally, I'm absolutely certain, I am positive, very confident, that if you were only willing to get this out of the way, you would find this so overwhelmingly helpful in every game, pretty much every game you play from now on, that you would then agree afterward, yes, it was worth doing. I dated someone when I was in college that would constantly kind of struggle to agree to go on a walk together, but then always be really happy we did, like ecstatic that we did. Even if she didn't say she was really excited about it, she was also just visibly uplifted by that experience. It's been very thoroughly documented scientifically that this is effective anyway. And she might have just been coddling me, but I don't think she was. I think that it's true that people sometimes have difficulty looking forward to the future where it will have been worth it. But it is, some people will evangelize and say, but you just have to trust me. I know it doesn't seem like it's going to be worth it, but it will be. I hate doing that. I don't want people to just trust me. I want people to agree or disagree with me based on my arguments. But it feels like a little bit of, like, I really think this will be beneficial if you can just stick with me for like 10 minutes, but then it's got to be short too. That's another key, is it needs to be relatively short. I think, sometimes people quote statistics about attention spans, like people will pay attention for like a half hour. Cut that into thirds for a start, if not more than that. Forget it. You're not going to hold most people's attention for a half hour. That's not even an insult to most people. I just think that's unreasonable for most busy people to just give up a random, probably kind of arbitrary, by the way, half hour of their life. Like, you don't know what half hour. It's just some random half hour. Hell no. Like, you've got 10 minutes tops. If the video's timestamp says like 4 digits instead of 3, it's longer than 9 minutes and 59 seconds. Forget it. I mean, I don't know. I have no idea, by the way. I'm just saying personally, I don't know if I'm going to feel good about that video unless it's that short. Which I kind of hate. Like, there's a way in which I love the idea of being able to just not worry about how long it is. But what are you going to do? So what are the methods here? Well, the reason I brought up the example before about all the objections people would have is because my plan, I guess, would be to find a way of explaining that triggers the least objections, I guess. Or the way of presenting the topic, maybe, that doesn't upset as many objections. Or, I think a tactic that might be effective or might be overwhelming would be to add into the pitch for this idea, add in very brief explanations for each bit that people might object to, and assure them that I'm going to explain those at length later. I do have an explanation for those things. Please don't get hung up on that right now. So when I say, without doing any math, because otherwise all the multipliers wouldn't be worth building. There'd be no reason to have lots of different multipliers if it wasn't sensible to make use of them in conjunction in some way. As if one of them was just better, there would be no, but see, this is just too much. I'll explain that in 1 second. I would then say, I promise I'll actually explain in depth later, but that's the short answer of like why that works. The mathematical reason, just by the way, or the game design reason is really what it is. I shouldn't say just the word math shouldn't even be in this parlay. I mean, in this video, hypothetically in this parlay. The game design reason, we'll say, is basically just that logically there would be no reason to have multiple stats if one of them is worth building at the expense of all others most of the time. Why are there other stats then, if one of them is just mathematically superior? Therefore, the stats must be made in a way where, for one reason or another, they are by default best when combined, rather than by default best if you don't combine them. Because otherwise there would be huge amounts of the game which have absolutely no purpose, whichever one the player encounters first, and then determines that it's efficient to stack them up, they will do that, and then the other ones will feel irrelevant. Even if they have some niche purpose later, I just don't think that's good design, and indeed I've seen that very rarely in games that are actually trying to have good build systems. So the game will make it so that it is mathematically sensible to combine those multipliers. And to do that, the game will have to make sure that you get about the same amount of those stats from various sources within reason. So for two quick examples, by the way, since I've done like the entire video during this parlay, and you might now be thinking, wait, like, can I actually just have the explanation of that thing? The short version for now is, for example, in Warframe, when you use the staple mod that gives you a big chunk of base damage, multi-shot, elemental damage, crit chance, those have all been balanced so that they are vaguely equally viable. The base damage mod, for secondaries mostly, is kind of the odd one out. It is a lot more, about twice as much more than the elemental damage mod, for example. But if you look at primaries and melee weapons, the base damage mod, the multi-shot mod, as it were, the elemental damage mod, etc., the number on the mod, you don't even have to know mathematically how they interact, but literally just the number on the mod is in the same ballpark. So for example, for primary weapons, Serration adds 165% base damage. It doesn't even say base damage. You don't even know how that affects your weapon, but it says 165% damage. You don't even know what that means, but the number is 165. The elemental mod says 90% electricity damage. You don't even know how that works. You don't even know how it works mathematically. It doesn't matter. But the game is saying 90 there. And then the multi-shot mod, it says 90. They kept the numbers kind of similar. Imagine if the base damage mod said like 500%, and then the other one said like 90%, and you'd be going, why? Like, why not just use the base damage mod, right? They're close enough. This is what they tried to do. I don't know if it worked. They're close enough that the player assumes they're all good, hopefully. But the base damage mod is better enough that the player will just put it on and not worry about it, because Warframe intends that to be a sort of a given, and also as a progression mechanic, because it's got a lot of ranks, you can rank it up. All that stuff. Again, you might be thinking, why do you need all these details? And you probably don't, to explain it basically, but a lot of people I've experienced will get hung up on, but then why is this one a lot more? And it doesn't really matter for this method mathematically, but they will get stuck on that idea. Like that, wait, that thing you just said seems not to be true, because here, look, here's an exception. And the important thing about doing this is to understand that the trend holds, even though there are exceptions that you need to understand in their specific games. Warframe, for example, is using that base damage mod in a weird, kind of specific to Warframe way, but that doesn't make this method unhelpful. You just have to look past that and understand that it's still broadly the same situation as in other games. And I do not know for the life of me how to get people to do that. Now, I went on a lot about a very specific example, but I did that because I wanted to highlight how a lot of explaining, in my experience anyway, is I would almost describe it as kind of annoying There's these roadblocks that it feels like, can't I just explain the thing and get the person not to worry about it? But I really believe that one of the keys of explaining things to someone is that you can't do that. You really can't. People lose a lot of their attention span, a lot of their desire to listen and hear the explanation if you tell them, oh, but don't worry about that part for now. That's the part they're thinking about. You've got their mental energy. They're working on something about that problem, but not the part that you're on, you know? And I have no idea how to make that into a usable video. I guess I could just make a choose your own adventure thing of videos. And also, by the way, just as a concluding thought, some of you are thinking this is not necessary. Like, yeah, I'm really glad to hear some people say that, sure. Some of you are thinking, you could just explain, it's fine, that doesn't bother me. But there are lots of people for whom it's a huge hang-up. And so, I don't know, it's hard. Like, different strokes for different folks, and that's what makes edumacating or sharing your ideas hard. Because the same way doesn't work for everyone. And least of all, here in Parley, where I didn't prepare, I do this on the spot, having a script would help greatly. I have one last thing. I personally think that it is in your best interest to not attempt to explain before you have a plan for explaining. If you're going to discuss something with someone in your personal life, it's not always about builds like with me. I recommend asking them if they wouldn't mind basically making a bit of an occasion. In other words, say to them, do you have time now to talk about this? No. Say, hey, this evening at 8:30, can we talk about this? I really want to try to explain this to you or share this with you. Can we do it at this time? Or can we do it after dinner? Some plan like that. I really do feel like that makes a big difference. Having the person have set aside time. They're not waiting to do something else. They're not thinking about doing something else. They don't have to worry about that as much. And you have time to kind of prepare to discuss the thing a little bit. I really do believe if you want to get in touch with other people, it's useful to have a few formal moments where you sit down and say, hey, this is a thing about me. I'm going to put in the effort to do it once, do it right, and get this thing understood. Or there's a thing about someone else and you say, I really want to understand that about you. You always do this thing and I'm just interested in it, or it upsets me and I want to understand why you do it. Put in the effort to make an occasion or an event. There aren't enough things like this in most people's lives that you need to do this that often. So put the effort in. Go out to dinner. I don't know. Something like that. That's probably a little excessive for most people in their casual life. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I personally think that it's worth focusing effort on these things. I'm always kind of galled. I don't know why I'm talking so much about things I judge about people's relationships. I'm sorry, but I'm not that sorry, apparently. I'm always kind of galled by meeting people who've been there. Like, we've been together for like a year and a half. I have a friend who I'm not going to tell this to directly, at least this way. I would say it in a nicer way, who's been dating someone for a year and a half. And they have basically not had like a real serious conversation with the person, or like they haven't, spent the night together. I'm not talking about like sexy times necessarily. They probably have done that. In fact, they've definitely done that. What I mean is they haven't, like gotten a Airbnb or a Verbo or whatever, not sponsored by the way, to sleep in together, to just have the experience of living in the same place for a little bit. That's fine, I guess. But why? Like, what's even the point? I don't know. Like, it's like they don't even spend time together. Or they, again, I talk to them about something pretty serious to them, and we're close friends. Like, you would expect this person to talk to me about this subject. And they said, like, I don't really talk to my friends about this, or I haven't really talked to anyone about this. And I think, not your partner of several years? Really? It's not that, like, deep down a thing about them. Have you talked to anything like that with them? I don't know. I worry sometimes that people kind of never take the time to formally discuss something and reach a greater understanding. I honestly feel like I know my partner who I've known for like 10 years, but I've only been dating this time for 6 months. I often have interactions with my partner now, and we dated in college for a few years too, that make me think I know this person better than my parents know each other after like, however long. I'm not going to tell you how old my parents are. That. And the reason is just because it's part of my life. Trying to understand this person is like, I like her. Of course I want to understand her. I'm dating her because I like her. I want to know about things about her. I want more her. That's why I'm dating her. I don't know. Isn't this the obvious? Anyway, I'll stop. I think that the biggest thing you can do for communication is enthusiasm. And so if you can show that you really care about understanding the thing, I think people will respond to that. If you're really excited about the thing, I think people will respond to that. If you can embrace what your conversation partner is interested in or fixated on, even if it seems like a bad way to explain it, just go with it if you can. Do the best you can to embrace that feeling, because that's what you need. You want their attention, you want their mental energy. You've got it if they're excited about something. So yeah, that's what I think. For my video, I don't know, man. I'm gonna have to go back to the drawing board about that one.